and we read Catcher in the Rye as a part of a class we have called Travel and Transformation, which all the 10th graders take. And they read everything from the Odyssey to Siddhartha to Catcher and Louisa, what am I forgetting? Frankenstein. Hamlet. So it's a wonderful course. And every year at the end of the year we say, should we keep Catcher? And every year at the end of the year they say, absolutely keep Catcher.
And I teach publishing law and mostly copyright law, but it's wonderful teaching publishing law, amongst other things, because there's so much to teach about J.D. Salinger. My name is Kate McGovern.
My name is Kevin Flynn. I'm going to be your moderator. I have no bona fides whatsoever. I just was asked to moderate. The closest, because I write for New Hampshire Magazine, and Rick Broussard, the editor, thought it would be funny if I did one of those pilgrimages to Cornish to find J.D. Salinger. And the article today didn't quite go the way I thought, because they're going to set me up with a photographer and we do all these silly things. I thought it would be great to have, my arm around some guy with a black bar over his eyes, and the photographer couldn't make it, so I was kind of on my own. And I went to the neighborhood and basically found the house, and before I got it, I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? Because that sort of part, isn't that sort of part of the mystery and intrigue is, bigger than the books and bigger than the reputation is sort of the fable of the recluse. Has anybody here gone to Cornish to do that? Or thought about it?
No.
No? Never thought about it. Oh.
Going to Cornish, no, but these are the books.
You got the books.
How old does this book look to you?
That looks like you probably had that in junior high school, or...
That's what mine looks like.
This one?
Can't see, which one is that? That's the...
70s.
9 stories. So, let me start with the two of you. Was there anything about the movie that surprised you, that you didn't know? Anything in particular that you learned that...
One of the things that surprised me about the movie was the very dramatic music. Da, 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 da. I thought that could have been a little bit more subtle. But I think seeing those scenes where he was going into the complex that was a part of Dachau, and I think I'd read about that, but to actually see those moments where they were able to project the kinds of things he might have seen was really powerful. And it was interesting because I think often when we read Catcher, students will actually sort of forget that he's lost his brother, that his brother's died. And so they're so caught up in the story of this young person and the alienation he feels and all of those ways that they connect with him that sometimes they forget the death that is the undercurrent in the book. And so there was something about seeing those scenes in the biography that made me really think about that undercurrent in his life a little differently.
I enjoyed seeing the picture of Whit Burnett because he figures very, very much, his letters figure very, very much in a case I really, really enjoy teaching when I'm teaching students, just basically copyright. And then, as I said, if I'm teaching publishing law, we come back to a lot of the cases involving Salinger. As you can imagine, there are many of them. I really liked the comment that was made in there, because something else that I teach is rights of privacy and publicity, or sometimes referred to as celebrity rights. And it's very, very interesting that people work so very, very hard to become famous, and then after they become famous, they don't want to be famous anymore. And I think his life, to some degree, explains that very, very much. And of course, my students, even in law school, are still, they're media children. I mean, they really are. And they thrive on all of that celebrity and people getting to be known. They themselves are so known. It's shocking to me. Our son is involved in privacy law, and I'm just shocked by what students put on their Facebook and on their Twitter. I think everybody in this room probably agrees with me on that. And I always tell the students that rights of privacy is about, I don't want you in my life, and if you are in my life, I'm going to make you pay. And the publicity is that if you want to come into my life, I'm going to make you pay too. And as I said, I think that his life shows that very, very much. But these letters that he constantly wrote to wit and to a woman who we just know from the case Elizabeth Murray as being a friend. And then also he actually wrote to Learned Hand, one of the most famous American jurists that we certainly have. And they all figure into this very, very important case where we look at the issue of exactly what is fair use. And the students love it because in one moment the court is saying, okay, this is for Ian Hamilton, whose name you will notice did not appear amongst his biographers because they actually had an injunction against his book that was never published. And so one time Ian Hamilton would be winning, and then another time J.D. Salinger would be winning. And eventually he wins because of the way the court looked at the fact that these were letters, and they were unpublished letters, and that they were never meant at this particular time to be available to the public. So even in legal cases, he's bringing some kind of fascination.
And before we get into sort of the backstory and talk about the book, I want to ask you a question. I also want to pose this to the audience. Let me put it this way. J.D. Salinger was not a private citizen in the sense that he wrote those books, he got them published, he cashed the checks. He is what the Supreme Court said, that he thrust himself into the public vortex. And so, to some extent, his right to privacy is somewhat compromised. So the question to you, and then I'd love to hear from the folks here what they think. Did J.D. Salinger really have an expectation that he could just move to Cornish and that no one should bother him and that for 40 years no one should try to write about his life or anything like that? I mean, to the extreme that he went and the extreme that the Salinger in the woods myth lives, was that a reasonable expectation for a literary figure? What do you think?
Well, remember what Greta Garbo said, I long to be alone. And people left her, alone. Charlie Chaplin just picked up and went. And certainly certainly as I said, he protected himself. He's involved in more than one piece of legislation. And he just decided that was the way he wanted his life to be. And as the holder of the copyright, you can see the way he's left an estate behind. And so much so that we even tried, as you all probably know, tried to have legislation written here in New Hampshire. And this is something that we battle a lot in this field, is the protection of the copyright, the whole question of First Amendment and exactly what is expression. And in that particular case, they tried, his estate now tried to protect his image. The story goes very sentimentally told by his son that this photographer jumped out from behind a bush and took his picture of this startled old man and then put it on a t-shirt. And they tried to write legislation saying that that kind of an image had to be protected, that this should not be allowed. And the legislation failed. And
because the copyright belongs to that photographer.
And no, because, yes, that is very true. And, but also because Governor Lynch said that this would be too much of a chilling effect on the expression of that photographer. So we battle that in class all the time, and it's really very interesting how you divide a class, you know, in just dealing with copyright in general.
So again, the question about sort of, he's living in the woods and, you know, don't anyone bother me, I'm not a celebrity, double standard. What do you think?
Well, I think, as a teacher, I always go back to the text. You know, we always say to the students when you're building an interpretation, go back to the text, go back to the precedent. And I think there's something so poignant in the scenes in which Holden is listening to jazz. And jazz is built on this whole idea, you know, of variation, individual variation on common structures. And I think when he's listening to one of his favorite musicians, and there's this sense, he said, you know, Ernie used to be really great, but then he became commercial. And he's looking at Ernie through this glass window, and there's this sense that somehow when your work becomes popular and when people begin to expect something consistently from the work, you lose something genuine in the creation of it. And he's so, and Holden is so fiercely protective of that sense that there's something genuine and authentic that happens between the individual and the imagination and that moment of connection. And for him, that creativity seems to always come back to authentic moments where you're writing about something that's real, like the loss of your brother or something like that. And then there's a line that you cross of repetition and commercial success that makes you lose something. And so when I think of Salinger in that bunker, in sort of this physical manifestation of imagination, it's him, his imagination, and the paper, I think I feel protective almost for him, in the sense that I think in not wanting Catcher to become a movie, he's sort of preserving for all of us, as readers, that feeling you have in childhood of, this experience is authentic, it's in your mind, it's what you imagine, it's what you make, and it might change the next time you read it, and it might change as you talk about it, but it's not going to become a publicly held item that no longer belongs to you. So I think I admire something about that, particularly in this day and age.
Anyone else have an opinion other than Rick Broussard? No, I'm just kidding. Anyone else have an opinion? I'm going to run with this. Anybody have an opinion on J.D. Salinger, the man, and his insistence that, like, he wants to be left alone?
And, you know, it occurred to me watching this that Salinger became famous back when fame was really just beginning. Fame as we know it today was just beginning, and he saw it. He was a good enough storyteller that he saw where this was going, and I have to wonder what, you know, he died too early to know, to get his reaction to this, but what would J.D. Salinger, being fond of young women, think of Miley Cyrus?
What do you think about it? Anyone else? I thought about it. Did his sort of insistence in seclusion not also sort of feed upon itself, that the more he wanted to be left alone, the greater the appeal to the public, or at least some part of the public, become that he should be out in the open, or at the very least, you know, these strange pilgrims who go and try to knock on the door and get some kind of wisdom? And you have a comment?
I have a comment. Sure. I have a background in publishing and productions and creatives, and I'm on the business side, so I work with both. So I know the pole of both, where you have commerce going, we want you, and you have the creatives going, get away from me, and you can go up to the mountain. And I usually compare that with the idea that each one of us has a profession that we want to excel at, those of us who want to be known in our industry. But if you're a phenomenal woods carver, or phenomenal architect, or phenomenal whatever you are, you find renown in your field, but you don't have people chasing you down the street, or, you know, huddling after your kids, or shoving a camera in your face. So you have to look at the fact that, yes, there's a human being here that we admire, but there's also a human being here who, by his nature, wants to live in a place where he can create more of that. And finding that balance is not an easy thing now. It's because we live in a world that says, oh, public everything. And I'm like, you need to keep in mind that in order for someone like that to do great work, they also need their space.
I don't have to bring the microphone.
Yes, I do.
No.
you want me to hold it like it's, or do you want to do like karaoke?
Sally, Jesse, Raphael. So, but wouldn't, if Salinger had just lived like a normal author, wouldn't he have been left alone? Wait, didn't he bring it upon himself? There are plenty of authors who write incredible work and who aren't just overshadowed by it.
Right, but you, I'm sorry.
That's it. This is what it's about.
But you don't see, I think, and I can't speak for Salinger, obviously, I'm not, but I'm saying, when you, I think the part that I see kind of spooks other people who are really good at what they do is that it isn't the fact that they're really good at what they do, it's the fact of the worship factor, where you're going, somebody's like, tell me how to solve my problems, and oh, guru, and I kind of think that's the part where it was like, no, this is just fiction, get away from me, and I think that's the difference, where it turns out to be a fetish or a piece, and that's not really easy to.
Who else does that happen to?
Well, it happened with Lennon, John Lennon. He had people who kept those people at periphery, but if you go back to certain people who were worshipped, idolized, there's that common theme of just, oh my goodness, now I think I'm a god and I can't do this. It's not easy for a creative.
The difference I think with John Lennon is he sort of took like a 5-year period off in the 70s. However, he still remained accessible in New York and whatnot, and he went back into the studio to write. And maybe it's, I know you're coming up with one, but I think that's an interesting point. Is that, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at. If he had maybe handled it a little differently, which is not to say that he wanted to handle it differently. I mean, I think we see a very deeply scarred psychological man here, that if he hadn't done that, if he'd done it differently, he wasn't interested in doing it differently. But maybe the consequences of being the secluded hermit for 40 years just made him, he was the unicorn, to catch. You wanted to say something?
Well, you just alluded to it. I was just thinking of him not as the author, but as a man who had experienced something that none of us can even imagine, even though we've seen the photos of it. And that we take care of those returning from war, or we try to anyway, some of them, and treat them for post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this man wasn't. And, I feel in my heart that he had every right to do whatever he wanted, and, rather than face his public as something other than they know of him, they probably, didn't know how, none of us knew how distressed he was. But I think he had every right to live his life the way he wanted to.
And I also think it's important that, for GIs from World War II, there wasn't a lot of public acknowledgement of combat stress as there were for like Vietnam vets and our modern vets, and that if you talk to a lot of World War II vets, like his friend, I never told my wife that, and here he is in his 70s, and he's lived with that his whole life. You have some.
Well, it was surprising to me how much rejection he faced in his early submissions of articles, and it might have been, or at least one factor could have been, he didn't want to have to live up to expectations to constantly produce. He was going to write when he wanted to write and what he wanted to write, but really didn't. He had a lot of rejection in his life.
Did someone? Yeah. Thanks.
I was just going to add, yes, the experiences through the war certainly, but there seems to be even experiences before that were the underlying factors that maybe weren't dealt with, and that he carried a lot of challenges and conflicts. That would be I'd go back a little further.
Lindley, I want to go back to you. So after Franny and Zooey, it definitely appears, that the critical acclaim was not the same as for Catcher in the Rye. And, like I just saw, I'm thinking of Charlie Chaplin and thinking of Orson Welles, who had sort of their great works, their masterpieces come very early in their career, and they never were able to match it.
Norman Mailer. Yeah.
Norman Mailer, sure. Several others, Do you think that he was afraid to, not write, but to be published again after, and which is one of the reasons why there's this, this vault filled with manuscript?
Yeah, Yeah, raise your hand if you think he was afraid to publish again. Yeah, I would raise my hand. I was just curious to see how many of you felt that way. I mean, there was a really wonderful piece. Lots of people have mixed feelings about Eat, Pray, Love, but there was a really wonderful piece by the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, in which she interviewed different writers to talk with them about that notion that, you know, once upon a time, we used to think that when someone created a work that we would say was a work of genius, that they really had this sense that it was a gift from the gods. You know, that you prayed to the muses, the muse came to you, they gave you this gift, and you delivered something that was not of you, but was given through you. And there was no necessary expectation that you would be given this gift again. And yet you move into the 20th century, and as these guys were saying, you know, we were all waiting for the big book. Wow, what a way to kill the big book. I mean, so I think, and then to hear that and this, what was so fascinating, saying that he's parsed this out over time, and yeah, I mean, I think again, in almost a protective view, I could see him wanting to say, I don't want to be there when these come out, these beautiful things, these beautiful children.
You know, one of the things, I'm sorry, I don't know, you go ahead and
No,
your thought.
I just wanted to pick up on a word that you used, protective, because that's something that although I very much loved Catcher in the Rye, I think I've always preferred the Zooey books.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, but those books, kind of those two long short stories, sort of appealed to me even more so. And but he was very protective of his work, and I'm sure many of you in the audience realize that in the mid 20s, in the mid 2000s, we had someone by the name of John David California. And he had written this parody called 60 Years Later, Coming Through the Rye. And it was produced in Sweden first. And then they tried to publish it here in the United States. And the author was saying, no, it's parody. And again, that's a very, very delicate situation as to exactly what is parody. I mean, the courts tell us time after time after time, yet with each case we apply that whole concept of parody again, and they again in the first Ian Hamilton case, where they tried to rewrite what he had written, paraphrasing. Even there, the court said, no, you are still paraphrasing far, far too close to what you are really quoting. And you are not.
Fair use.
And we're talking fair use, yeah, absolutely. And in the parody case, the court said, no, this is absolutely not parody. You are totally infringing that story. And I often wondered sometimes if maybe the court itself was not protecting this work that, you know, it's seminal to all of us, I think, because of when we read it in our lives. And so I was very happy when you used the word protection, because there is that.
One of the things that I've found surprising about the movie is that Salinger storms the beaches of Normandy with chapters of Catcher in the Rye, you know, on his person. And it's hard to, although, you know, the themes of the prep school and sort of his youth there, it's hard to imagine Catcher in the Rye having been written without Salinger having been shaped by World War II. And I wonder what the book would have been like if he had stayed stateside and been just trying to get in the New Yorker for those, you know, for the next 10 years. I mean, does anyone agree you sort of see, you know, that experience, you know? Well, I mean, you know, say he feel, you know, if Holden is a projection of himself, and Holden is somewhat, you know, on the edge, that seems to very much describe Salinger and certainly how he viewed himself, I think.
It's very much, someone said something about Norman Mailer, and but also, you know, you asked the same question about Kurt Vonnegut. If he had not had those experiences, what? You know, and if all that he was looking forward to is to have something printed in the New Yorker, what would that have just been like?
Yeah, comment over
Maybe
here.
I wanted to ask you a question about when you present, Catcher in the Rye to students. When I read it umpteen years ago, 51 years ago, it was when I read it as a sophomore in high school. We were not given any of the historic background of J.D. Salinger, his World War II experiences and all the trauma of that. That really changes one's perspective. I mean, I was not aware of any of this background. And I guess I could have gone on to Wikipedia and read his history and found out about it. But this is...
Not when you were in high school.
Not when I was in high school, but now. I mean, now, if I'm curious, I find out an author's background and so on. When you present this book, do you give that background, or is this something you think would color the student's ability to experience the work on its own merits?
You're asking the million-dollar question that English teachers have to ask themselves all the time, right? How much do you shape their views by talking about the writer, and how much do you let them experience the book sort of in this moment in time? And that's such a good question. I think I laughed when I saw the South Park. I think that was South Park. Because, if I'm not quite sure, I'll say, this book was banned. And then, the minute you say it was banned, they can't wait to jump into it. And so this, but oftentimes we talk about it as, this is a young person who has experiences that remove him from everything that he knows, and that everything that can give him solace. And I think, and so then the question is, how do you find an anchor? How do you find solace in a world that doesn't seem to offer any? And for most of the readers, then they come to that place with the book. Or then there are kids who've gone on and they're really obsessed with the assassinations in John Lennon, or they're really interested in the historical context, or they're really interested in why did this book seem to take off in the 60s, and the 60s seem like ancient medieval times to them now. But so they find different ways in. So it doesn't often take much of an introduction. A lot of them have heard about Catcher in the Rye. A lot of them have had their parents say, this was my favorite book. So there are lots of ways in. So you didn't have any introduction when this book was given to you?
The viewpoint for all the things we read was to, it was maybe the fashion of that era to let the work stand on its own without prejudice about where the author was coming from and what trauma they may have had and that sort of thing that may have given rise to their need or their desire to write a piece of literature. It's sort of this faithfulness to the text kind of idea.
I think that bit from South Park, if I remember that whole episode, was that the boys were so enthralled with the fact that, the book was banned and it was the biggest book that they set out they were going to write the worst, filthiest book in the world, and the goal was that everybody who read it vomited immediately. And by the time they actually got around to reading Catcher in the Rye, by their standards, they were like, hey, they didn't think all that, they didn't think it was all that bad. They have a comment here.
I just have to say that sometimes when I start to introduce the Salinger versus Random House case, I'll say to the students, how many of you know J.D. Salinger? And invariably someone in the class, and I'm talking about law students now, they'll say, oh, yeah, that was the episode on South Park. And it's like, well, yeah. And of course, if I can say, well, yeah, then it's kind of like, hey, maybe she is hip after all. She recognized South Park. But it's just really so interesting the way the frames of reference do change.
I just wanted to say that it seems to me the way that J.D. Salinger would answer the question about author biography versus the work stands alone is pretty clear, especially from the presentation in the film. And I was just struck thinking about some works that come down to us in history from Greek and other poets and so on, which is an incomplete bibliography and no details at all about the author's life, and yet we can relate completely to the works of art. And I wonder if Salinger looks at something being created as being so self-contained and perfectly constructed that that's how it ought to be approached, as opposed to Elia, stay away from my door.
Right. I'm going to get to some people up here, but Lindley, as I'm walking up, I want to ask you, I I think two books that complement one another, sort of the same side of the coin, are Catcher in the Rye and Lord of the Flies, where you have Catcher in the Rye is basically saying society is bad, and Lord of the Flies saying we need society, otherwise that there's chaos. And do you see, you're nodding your head, do you see the sort of the the issue there?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting in the balance of a course with young people. You know, I think they often leave Catcher in the Rye feeling sad and depressed, and they want to believe that he goes into this therapist and he tells this story and that somehow something redemptive is going to happen in that moment. And because we live in the era of psychology and psychotherapy, and many of these kids have had great experiences themselves with therapists, and they trust them for the most part. You know, I think there's a sense that for them, the next part of the story is really important. And it's just fascinating to me how often they choose as the assignment, they'll choose to write the new ending. And I think what they write is sort of the Lord of the Flies, but in a much happier community, where there are people there to sort of bring Holden forward. That often they say he goes off into the wilderness, he goes to some farm, he meets back up with Jane, who, you know, they think is the love of his life, or Phoebe comes and meets with him, and they create a happy ending for him. So they, in a way, they create the society that I think he was waiting for.
We have a comment over here.
I'm 85 and I knew Salinger.
Oh!
I can't say I knew him. I had collected all of his stories out of the New Yorker, and I had fantasies of finding out. I think I knew where he lived on Park Avenue. I was going to the Dalton School in New York City when I was in high school, and then I went to Sarah Lawrence, and I had fantasies of knocking on his door and saying, "I'm Eloise, let me in." And but then one day somebody called me and said, he's here, he's over at the calf. And they didn't have to say who's here, I knew, and I ran over to the calf, and he was sitting with Mrs. King's writing group. He'd been a guest in her writing class at Sarah Lawrence, and they were all over at the calf for coffee, and I was just about to fall out of my seat trying to listen to them, and he turned around and said, "Why don't you join our table?" And I did, and he asked my name, and he said, "Are you a writer, Miss Bennett?" And I said, I can't believe I said this, but no, I'm a Salinger fan. And I was a pre-med student, and he said, "Oh, really? You know, that's what I've often thought I really wanted to do." And it was just a brief moment, but he was so relaxed, so welcoming, so gentle. You know, to think of him, the way he became so frightened and aloof.
Before Catcher in the Rye?
Yes, it was before. I graduated in 50, and so when was Catcher in the Rye published?
51.
Yeah, it was before it was published, but I had all of his stories in the New Yorker, which I read and read and read. I just wanted to share that.
That was very nice. Well, you're an original Salinger fan. I'm curious about, Jimmy, you'll let me know when we're running short on time here. I'm curious about, the new books that are coming out. And I think J.D. Salinger, I fear that he is in this realm with people like George Lucas and Paul McCartney and Stephen King, where they are so big that no one else, the editor, the producer, no one else has the gravitas to tell them what is mediocre. And their work is uneven. And Salinger, has, I said, worked in seclusion, apparently with no other editor, with no editor at all, writing and rewriting. I guess the expectations are very high for certainly a book that, has Holden Caulfield as a character in it, and the Glass family. What is the likelihood that the literary expectations will be met? I mean, is there what are the chances? I mean, I think, this is just my opinion, and you can all disagree. I think there's a better than 50% chance that these are mediocre books.
Not the CIC one.
No, it's a lot of head nodding. That's fine.
I'm trying to remember who it was, and it might have been Thomas Pynchon or somebody who said, if you waited 10 years to have your last child, when they came out, you wouldn't say, "Oh, you're very disappointing." And I think I don't know how to answer that. I'm worried that he was just in there scribbling madness, but I don't know.
Hey, you have an opinion on that?
Well, I have to say too that a couple of the books were directly about his life, so I would think that those books in particular, they couldn't really be mediocre. I mean, his life is fascinating. I don't think that there's really a place for him to go wrong with that. With the other ones, since there are high expectations, there might be, but I doubt it.
Yeah, totally. It's the teased titles. There's a lot of semi-autobiographical stuff there. How about your opinion?
Well, I wonder if even, I don't know how edited Catcher in the Rye actually ended up being, from his draft to the work after. But even if, the structure of the sentences is mediocre, even if it might be a mediocre work, it might be such that the characters tell such a great story about, the people in the story, it might not matter if it's mediocre. Yeah, some people will say that about Stephen King, that he's a great storyteller, but if you just look at the writing, and that's not something I know much about, but, some people will say the writing isn't necessarily the most important thing that might come out of it. The characters might just be so stellar that even if the writing is mediocre, the work itself might not be mediocre.
That actually seemed to be one of the criticisms of the later stuff, that it was all tone and no plot. But you have an opinion.
Actually, I have a question on another issue, but if
Go ahead.
other people want to talk about this issue, then
Everybody's going to buy the book, so I guess we
Catcher in the Rye or a different book. I'm sorry, I missed the movie. I hope, will you be showing it again at any time soon, or?
It's till through Thursday.
Through Thursday?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Next week, okay, well, we'll see if we can.
This week, Thursday.
I actually have to do, pardon?
This week, Thursday.
Oh, so that's just tomorrow?
Yeah.
Oh,
Is this Wednesday?
I got the, okay, 2 days, okay.
2 days.
Well, maybe we have some time to come tomorrow. But anyway, I missed the earlier discussion, so pardon me if I'm raising issues that you've already covered. I'm actually currently teaching Catcher in the Rye now. I've taught it before several times, and one discussion around the faculty table has been, to what extent do we take into consideration, do we tell students about these allegations that have been made? And if you already raised this issue in your discussion, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but the allegations that were made by his former lover against Salinger for these inappropriate relationships with young girls. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and should this color, I guess the question is, as teachers, should we mention that, or is it relevant? And there was even some discussion about not even teaching the book, because this casts such aspersions on Salinger's character.
Well, certainly the filmmaker, I don't know, please correct me, but if you didn't come away with that, but there is certainly, even in this film, the fact that he was always having these associations with these young women. And as I said, in the Random House case, the letters are to Whit Burnett, his teacher, if you will, and Learned Hand, who was a justice, and this woman, Elizabeth Murray, and the court just refers to her as a friend. And if you know his life, she may very well have been some of those young women. The problem is that unless that kind of information is given with absolute malice, it's perfectly fine to be able to discuss it. And so that there should be, it should be really a very, very interesting legal question about how much of this information do we give about an author's private life. And, when does it step over that line when it becomes malice?
He was never convicted of anything.
No.
Lindley, you're an instructor. As someone brought up, should the work speak for itself, or if you're going to, give us sort of background, is that a relevant fact to inform the work or not?
It's such a good question. How often would you turn down reading something that's been one of your favorites because you discovered that the person who wrote it was maybe morally or ethically either at least shady to repugnant? I guess as a teacher, we really try to talk about there's this work of art that is separate from the person. But I think that's my own bias. I think as, the people we love are so often flawed. And so to go back and look at John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln or more recently Bill Clinton, or we could come up closer and to sort of say that what they did wasn't of value or wasn't worth talking about. And then it adds I think for young people, it adds a great moment to talk about just the complexity of people. And we do great things and we do really flawed things. And it's so nice that you're giving your students the chance to talk about that.
It may be more appropriate if it were D.H. Lawrence, where there are less sexual overtones as opposed to maybe this piece of work.
Because actually sometimes the writing is going to come out of that flaw.
Yeah,
Right.
And good point.
And do we deny the fact that this is the kind of life that these people led? And out of it is coming the story. I think sometimes of the not that his life was necessarily flawed, but someone like Dickens. Dickens could probably not have written what he wrote except for what he saw. I guess because my background is originally theater, I love the works of Oscar Wilde, and I will read almost anything that has really anything to do with his life. And so many people have written so much about so many aspects of his life. And I just wonder if he hadn't led the life that he led, could he have left us the beauty of particularly the theater that we have from him? I just don't know. So students have to, I guess, realize that these authors have feet of clay.
One thing about the documentary we saw that I learned is that there was an awful lot of privacy insisted on all of the people who were interviewed. They all had to sign non-disclosures. They would only do it if it was not going to get back to Salinger. One of the people, and I know this because my wife conducted the interview on behalf of New Hampshire Public Radio, Joyce Maynard, with her new book was coming out, and she just said, when it was done, she just said, hey, this is coming out, and can I ask you some questions about it? And she was free about it. And she said, sort of the one thing, she has sort of always sort of been vilified as, having sort of glommed on to J.D. Salinger. She said today that, this is what happened to her. It's her true life. It's her experience. Why should she not write about it? And I guess if she were the lover of John Irving or somebody else who was not nearly so fastidious about his privacy, that maybe there would not have been the same kind of backlash. I don't know if anyone feels the same. One of the things I always thought was very kind of funny was sort of the cult-like buy-in that Cornish and that area gave to that idea that you're not going to point to a Salinger. People live there forever, and people who move in, it's just sort of the thing that you do. And I was a TV reporter, and I would knock on people's doors, and I'd ask them to spill secrets about people who were murderers, and, you know, horrible people. And neighbors would be happy to point where, but ask where J.D. Salinger is, and you know, it's like, no, and I did that, and people were like, I'm not going to tell you that, as if, you know, as if it were a patent place-like secret where his address was. I'm certainly not the first person. That always kind of amazed me. You know, I know we're New Hampshireites and we're flinty and we like our privacy, but to the extent that people bought in, I was always amazed.
Yeah, the question that I was wondering was, it talked about when those letters that he had written to Joyce went up for sale, and why it is that Peter Norton felt compelled to spend what I'm sure was an obscene amount of money just to continue to protect him, and what about Salinger made people feel that he had earned like such a heightened expectation of privacy that should be delivered upon.
Yeah, sure.
Dive into that thought, maybe head first. Maybe tied to it is, and because I hear this from different creatives, I think some of it may be tied into, if you're going to give someone that level of privacy, it's also a level of respect, a personal respect. Like, okay, you've done this for us in the world, but we understand that you prefer in your personal world to have a level of respect that says thus far and no further. We have this conversation a lot between business and creative.
So, there was a hand over this way?
I think I'm so struck by how many parallels there are between Holden and the real Jerry, and I feel like in a way he didn't ever grow up the way we never see Holden growing up, and people feel protective of him. I mean, just the fact that he had all these relationships with young women and then sent them away before they could disappoint him. Just like in Catcher, he doesn't ever call Jane. He wants to call her, he never calls her. And that he wants fame. I mean, that he's sending all those stories back to New York. He's desperate for fame when he's fighting in World War II, and then he gets it and he doesn't know what to do with it. I mean, he really was a stunted person, I think.
One of the comments, and I'll come to music, one of the comments that was attributed to him in this documentary is that he said that writing about Holden was the worst thing he ever did. And, you know, that deep regret. I don't know how shocking that, or should we not expect that if, given the way that the last half of his life turned out, is that not surprising that he would feel that way?
Well, that was such a stunning thing, I thought. That surprised me, and I just thought, what a paradox that, you know, he says, I'm just a fiction writer, I'm not a guru. And it's as though he wants to sort of say that even though this book is largely autobiographical, that it's just a fiction, and, you know, it's easy to just make everything psychological, but it just, I mean, this is a man who is stunningly afraid of intimacy. And so here he's written something of himself and sent it out into the world and revealed the most intimate parts of himself and can't pull it back, and yet he continues, and maybe that's why he holds on to all of those pieces until after he's died. I mean, I don't know, it's a mystery.
But that you mentioned about the fear of intimacy, I have to think back. I was 14 when I read it, 9th grade, or thereabouts, and it kind of struck me watching this movie the first time I'd ever really kind of heard any of that aspect of it. So there I am thinking, okay, I was a 14-year-old teenage boy at the time. He was writing these letters to 14-year-old girls. Doesn't click any odd buttons for me today in terms of what goes on in society, but I guess I was really seeing it. You mentioned earlier about just the word of his insecurities to start with. He relied on these young women for freedom to sort of, they were almost like his therapists in some obtuse way, perhaps. But I guess my question is, what did he expect out of the 3 women that he was actually married to, versus what his expectations were of these other, you know, what he got out of those relationships, and considering how horribly, I guess, he treated the last woman that he was married to.
I mean, I guess, well, this always raises an interesting question, I think, for me as a teacher with my students is, you know, I was so struck at the beginning of the film that every person they interviewed was a man in midlife. And I thought, that really pisses me off, right? And so I guess, and this is something I do wonder about, and I think we talk to our students about this a lot of, is this a really gendered book? And, you know, and one of my students pointed out to me one day, he said, well, you know, she said, I think he's on the side of girls because Holden is so angry with Stradlater, who she then pointed out to me, she said, you know, if you think about his name differently, it's Straddle and Ate Her. I was like, oh, okay. But I think, you know, so the book raises a lot of really interesting questions about what it means to be a young female reader, what it means to be a young male reader. And I think Holden's so thoughtful in so many ways that, but that's why I think maybe I need to separate Holden from J.D. Salinger because, you know, he was a difficult, let's put it this way, I wouldn't have walked my daughter in Nick's doorway.
No.
Like that other mother.
So, one more thought here, I may as well go really provocative here at the end. Because I haven't been so far, right? Look, so, again, the discussion is about Salinger, the man, the author, not necessarily the book, but if we can separate Catcher in the Rye for a second. And we think about American authors, we think about John Steinbeck, think about Ernest Hemingway, we think about John Irving, other great, William Faulkner, other great names of 20th century literature. In some ways, is J.D. Salinger not overrated as an author? Take away his one-hit wonder, The Catcher in the Rye. If there were a Hall of Fame, like a baseball Hall of Fame, you could say he had that one great season, but not a Hall of Fame career. So the question is J.D. Salinger overrated?
Oh, you wait for that CIC book.
I wait for that CIC book. Anybody think? Okay, way in the back.
It really depends on what the standard of the rating is. I've read a lot of his stuff, and I don't remember thinking it was the best writing I'd ever read, but I remember being touched by it and kind of, intrigued in a way, and I remember it, although I read it a long time ago, which isn't true of an awful lot of things that I read a long time ago. But to me, the thing that makes him great is, and it's a really postmodern thing, is that, they talk a lot about how he protected the Glass family and the Caulfields as if they were real. And yet when you think about him, my takeaway from this is what an amazing story this man's life was. Who could write a story like that? He was in the worst battles in World War II. He was there during the evacuation of the camps. He was, and then he led this weird quixotic, life, and sure, he had young women, but that has a, that is sort of a temporal chauvinism that we think that's odd. That great men or great people of any stripe had whatever they wanted in the past. So he assumed that. He has this religious dimension. It's a very meta story. And so I think the greatness of him is that he created a character that was bigger than he was. He made his life into his greatest work of fiction. And how many other writers have done that?
So I just blasphemed. I just said J.D. Salinger's overrated. No one else has a visceral reaction to that. No one wants to argue against that. Okay, I'm going to go. I haven't hit you back here. Again, always the top step. Right, here you go.
I don't think he's overrated because when the book came out at the time, it affected a great number of people. It doesn't matter if it was a literary success, except that he wanted to be in the New Yorker, but it affected so many people. I mean, I was just thinking about it when I read it. One of the assignments that we had was to compare and contrast J.D. Salinger and Ernest Hemingway. And, you know, it was 50 years ago, some odd that I read it too, and watching it tonight, it was like I read it yesterday. Franny and Zoe, you know, I didn't read the last one, but Franny and Zoe and then Catcher in the Rye. So I think the effect that it had and the impression that it left on people means it was not overrated.
Well, on behalf of the Red River Theater, I would like to thank everybody for coming out to see the special screening of Salinger and for taking part in our discussion panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.